Here to discuss that threat, Dan Kochis, research assistant for the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom, and joining us today from heritage.org in Washington, D.C. We thank you very much, Dan, for your time. And let's preface our conversation with what General Martin Dempsey had to say. He said the ongoing crisis in eastern Ukraine has prompted the Pentagon, I believe he used the words, dust off the unused battle plans from the Cold War, even going so far as comparing Putin's alleged involvement with the pro-Russian separatists in the Ukraine to what transpired with Germany's invasion of Poland in 1939. Another sovereign nation to achieve its objectives. It's the first time since 1939 they're clearly on a path to assert themselves differently, not just in Eastern Europe, but Europe in the main and towards the United States. Dan, do you agree with General Dempsey?
In large part, yes. I do think that there are very important differences between the Cold War and now, but there are certainly elements of the Cold War and what Russia is doing. I think at the end of the day, though, it's more neo-imperialist in that the Russians are looking to reconstitute a Russian empire. They're referring to many of the lands in Eastern Europe as Nova Russia, so, New Russia. And so the idea is that these are lands that are Russians to begin with, and that they're going to retake them. So I think that that's an important distinction. But at the end of the day, that's correct. Certainly, U.S. allies in the region, in the Baltic states and in Poland, very concerned about Russia's actions, and the United States should be as well.
Well, the simple question, a lot of media outlets have spoken of a new Cold War. Is there one underway started by Vladimir Putin?
Well, again, I don't think it's a new Cold War because the Russia isn't the empire that it used to be. It doesn't have the economic power that it used to be. Its fertility rate is so low that it's basically rotting from the inside. It's very poor. But there are distinct elements. Obviously, Russia's actions in South America, they're cozying up with Cuba once again, and certainly their aggression against their neighbors in Europe is very worrying and is somewhat reminiscent of parts of the Cold War.
Can anything or anyone stop Vladimir Putin? You mentioned the long-term economic viability of the Russian Federation. What's happening internally there in Russia?
Well, internally, the Russian, top brass, Putin and those around him, they're basically stealing from their people. If you go outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, it's actually quite poor. And these are basically kleptocrats that are taking money, taking the resources out of the ground and using it for their own personal gain. There are those that think that Vladimir Putin is actually the richest person in the world. But at the end of the day, what they're doing is they're feeding these sort of lies and deceptions to their people. The West is coming after us. We're protecting ethnic Russians. We're protecting Mother Russia. And so there was an interesting poll actually last week. Gallup poll stated that most Russians believe state TV. So when you sort of believe these lies, Putin and those atop can't then come back and say, well, actually, we weren't right about that, and then that's not the case. So they have to kind of continue to play into this.
Dan, does Putin really want to annex eastern Ukraine here? Following up on what you were just saying right there, when you look at the difference between eastern Ukraine and Crimea, Crimea, of course, had a Russian military base there, a naval installation, more ethnically Russian people, eastern Ukraine, a different set of circumstances.
That's correct. I do think that there is somewhat of a distinction there, right? So Crimea has obviously the port at Sevastopol that the Russians are very interested in. There are quite a few ethnic Russians in eastern Ukraine, but look, Russia can't afford to absorb them. They really couldn't afford to absorb Crimea into Russia, certainly the cost of the pensioners there. But at the end of the day, what they want is they want to destabilize Ukraine. They don't want a Ukraine that can go look to the West, look to joining NATO, look to joining the EU and sort of Western economics. They want to destabilize Ukraine. And so sort of this civil war that's going on plays very much right into the hands of the Russian leadership.
Now, is that the more likely scenario? You talked about the Russian people believing the state-run media lies. Does Vladimir Putin believe these lies? Does he think that's really the more likely scenario than perhaps more pressure coming from Europe with those sanctions expected this week?
I don't think that Putin believes the lies himself. I think that he recognizes that he needs to keep these up in order to keep power. But I do think there's a lot of concern within Russia that sanctions are going to come. But I think at the end of the day, they don't believe, especially for the Europeans and the European front, that it's going to happen. Remember, the EU has to make decisions based on consensus. And so Last week they met and they didn't agree to any sort of extended third-tier sanctions. There's quite a few countries, obviously, that have significant economic ties to Russia. And so while it's certainly a chance, we had Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister of the UK, say over the weekend that it's time for these third-tier sanctions. Whether or not they actually come down the road, I'm not quite sure that Putin and those around him believe that it'll actually happen.
When you say third-tier sanctions, what are we talking about basically, and are they of such a degree that the European reticence can be readily understood?
Sure. So right now, a second-tier sanction would be sort of assets, asset freezes, travel bans, things that we've seen going forward from the Europeans so far. These third-tier sanctions, these are sector-specific sanctions. They're more blunt, but they're also more successful in actually harming sort of the Russian economy. And so these are limiting access to certain technologies, closing the export market in Europe for Russian natural resources and other goods. And so there is quite a bit of reticence. I mean, you got to remember Germany, France, the UK, these countries have huge ties economically with the Russians. I will say that it's much more going the other way. The Russians are much more dependent upon Europe than Europe is on Russia. And I think that even within a place like Germany, which has the greatest economic ties to the Russians, you're sort of seeing a change in it. The German finance minister over the weekend said that there is going to be some pain for Germany, but that the consequences of not doing anything are really too great to not to continue to sit on their hands.
Well, if Europe continues to, in essence, sit on its hands, what might the United States do? You mentioned Vladimir Putin, the belief that he may be the wealthiest man in the world. Is there anything the United States can do directly to hit Putin in his own pocketbook, not just that of the collective Russian economy?
Sure. So, the problem there is that obviously Putin is going to be very good at hiding his money. And so the U.S. has tried to hit those around him. I don't know of any efforts so far from the Treasury Department to actually target Putin specifically, but certainly that could be something that the U.S. could do moving forward to try to target him in particular.
So we have this situation, Dan, where it's just too difficult to find Putin's money. Presumably, we have intelligence people involved in forensic accounting.
Sure.
Can't we narrow this down instead of hitting his associates?
I think so, but again, there's been a lot of reticence on the part of the administration to actually go after Putin himself, and obviously the same thing goes with actually going after the sort of these sector-specific sanctions that we discussed a little bit earlier. There's been a lot of reticence. The sort of, well, we'll get there. We're going to do this first. We're going to hit guys 3 levels down below Putin, and then if he doesn't listen, then we're going to ratchet it up. And sort of this piecemeal approach hasn't worked. But that's been the approach of the administration so far.
Well, the fact is we have so much involvement with Russia. I think about our space program and the fact that we basically have to hitch rides to the International Space Station courtesy of the Russian space program. Has there been so much interaction post-Cold War that part of the administration's reticence, and I admit I'm being somewhat charitable here, is the notion that we would be cutting off our nose to spite our face?
Well, I certainly hope that the administration wouldn't put in place tougher measures because of a space program. There are plans, I think, to use private sources within the United States to get goods up to the International Space Station. But look, at the end of the day, I think that the reticence of the Obama administration comes back to the fact that they really believe their own sort of narrative about the Russian reset, that Russia was an international player that was going to play by the rules, that they were a potential partner for the United States, that they had turned the corner. Clearly, that hasn't been the case. The author of the Russian reset admitted its failure a few months ago, but yet you still have people like former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton going out and saying that it's successful. And I just, when I heard that, I was just gobsmacked. I mean, it doesn't make any sense when you look at the facts on the ground, but I think that many in the administration still believe this.
And when you look, Dan, at the numbers here with these sanctions, the U.S. does, I think, something about $50 billion a year in trade with Russia. Europe's 10 times that. So anything the United States does without Europe's help is literally 1/10 as strong as what it would be with Europe's hand. Do those numbers match up based on what you've seen?
Sure. I mean, look, the U.S. sanctions are going to be much more effective, if the Europeans are involved. Because at the end of the day, much more trade goes through Europe, and the Russians can still go to Europe to get capital. Same thing goes with going to Asia. But there certainly will still be an effect from tighter U.S. sanctions if that's the route that the U.S. decides that they want to go.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Dan Kochis, the research assistant for the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation, we thank you very much for your time and your insights.
Of course, gentlemen, a pleasure. Thank you.
All right, you heard what Dan had to say. Looks like this leading from behind continues to carry with it some serious consequences.
That's the case, too. And also, at the same time, how long does Vladimir Putin think he can keep this up? It's almost a game of chicken between him and President Obama.
Well, he's got an incredible ability to really mold public opinion in his country via the media. Some would say an almost identical situation here, but I guess that would be an exaggeration. What do you say? Why don't you tweet us your comments on this at Newsmax TV, hashtag America's Forum. There's also newsmaxtv.com/comment. Our program continues after this.